Steven Crowder does not pretend to be an intellectual heavyweight. He is a comedian, and most of the time he's very funny. However, whilst I try and take his videos in as light-hearted a sense as possible, his recent rants aimed at supporters of climate change action and gun control are downright irresponsible. The ideas he's currently peddling are not in the least bit funny, and whilst he makes comedy from them, he also makes arguments, bad arguments, fallacious arguments, arguments from ignorance, and arguments that must be overcome and rebutted. We'll do climate change first because it's easy to demonstrate how wrong he is. The Hadley Climate Modelling Centre in Exeter, England, the following method is used to infer the effects of greenhouse gas emissions on global temperatures. Researchers first calculate the numbers and properties of photons hitting the Earth from the Sun. They then look at the composition of the atmosphere and the properties of the gases that make it up. They then use results in the lab to analyse how much energy is transferred to the Earth by photons hitting these gases, exciting them and being re-emitted. They then do the same analysis, increasing the amount of CO2 and equivalents in the atmosphere, and the results gained show that at a minimum, man-made climate change will make the Earth 2 degrees hotter by 2050 if we continue emitting at current rates. This is not to say the Earth will be 2 degrees hotter than it is now, but 2 degrees hotter than it would otherwise have been, all other things being equal. This is a crucial distinction. It doesn't matter that global temperatures may increase by less or probably more than 2 degrees as other effects kick in. What matters is that we know we will have affected our environment. Crowder does make a valid point, that the answer to anthropogenic climate change is not necessarily government banning high-emission activities. The answer is to change the relative price of emitting carbon. At the moment, the environmental damage caused by emitting a ton of carbon is ignored by us because we don't have to pay for it. This is called an externality. When you drive your SUV, you are unwittingly causing floods in Bangladesh and droughts in Australia, causing harm to a third party. If you were charged an appropriate amount for emitting carbon, you'd do it less, and the money you had to give up were then given to those affected by your actions. This would be the socially optimal course of action. According to calculations made by the Cambridge Climate Economics Group, a tax of roughly $40 per tonne of carbon emissions would be effective in halting the growth of said emissions. This roughly tallies with the Stern report a year prior, which recommended a $30 to $35 charge. If governments around the world were to implement such a tax tomorrow, we could halt climate change in its tracks for fairly negligible cost, something around 0.5 to a percentage point of world GDP. We could even use the money gained to abolish other unfair taxes like inheritance or other wealth tax, something of which I'm sure Mr. Crowder would approve. Now, gun control is a deal more complicated. As a classical liberal, my presumption is that everything should be permitted. But there are two kinds of state intervention I then consider. The first is taxation. This is appropriate where people undertake financial transactions that have unintended third-party consequences. Here one uses taxation to correct the externality, just like I talked about earlier with carbon emissions. The second is legal intervention. One makes some undesirable action illegal. Here we are not dealing with cost-benefit analysis and marginal abatement, as in the case of taxation, but with the loss of freedoms. Actions we should make illegal remove more freedoms from the injured party than the loss of freedoms incurred by making the action illegal. For example, my freedom to rape someone is not as important as that person's freedom not to be raped, thus we make the action illegal. Now, does gun control fulfill either of these requirements or action? It's hard to argue the taxation case. The act of purchasing a gun in itself does nothing. The gun was already in the system and it was already a danger. There's no extra social cost implied by it simply changing hands. The legal case, however, is much stronger. There is a clear imperative for not allowing the mentally ill or children to own firearms because there is a relatively large probability they can be induced to turn them on others. The freedom to not be shot is massively more important than the freedom to own a weapon, and so we remove it. But in actuality, the biggest risk of owning a gun to society is that you simply keep it in the system. If guns are not securely locked up, they can be stolen, and a gun in the hands of criminals is a hugely unacceptable risk. A single-shot rifle is no problem, it's hugely hard to conceal, but a semi-automatic or automatic handgun is incredibly dangerous. There is a compelling case to be made that Mr. Crowder's freedom to stroke his ego by owning a Colt .45 is insignificant compared to the freedom to live without the fear of concealed handguns. I think the UK has it about right, actually, if marginally too stringent. Assault weapons and handguns are outright banned. They have no purpose except as offensive weapons. Any decent marksman knows that such weapons are designed for practicality and easy unloading of large amounts of lead, not accuracy. We permit the owning of semi-automatic sporting rifles if you have a legitimate reason to own one. They are not, for example, permitted for people in high-rise tower blocks, and they must be kept securely locked up. I don't have a webcam, but if I did, I'd show you my 7.62 target rifle and my 2.2 sporting rifle, my 2 shotguns and my hunting crossbow. It's not just feeble intellectuals who want to protect society from firearms that have no sporting or hunting purpose and are designed for killing only. In the UK we barely have gun crime, and the criminals that use guns go to absurd lengths to get pretty feeble weaponry, often reverse-engineered replicas that will likely blow up in their face due to barrel or chamber bulges. Yet the UK target rifle and shotgun scene is massive. Gun sports are alive and well. For a huge gain in terms of the freedom to live without the fear of being gunned down, we have surrendered precious few freedoms of our own. And when the government comes knocking to do some of the oppression that Mr. Crowder so firmly believes it will, my ability to pick off dinner plate-sized targets at 6 to 1200 yards without a telescopic sight is undiminished by the fact that I had to get a proper license for my weapon. To be honest, I don't think it's likely a few small arms will help me much in a bare-knuckle fight with a 21st century armory and air force, do you? The argument that we need guns to prevent the government from getting too big for its boots belongs in the 19th century. It's infantile, given the current distribution of force in our society. Crowder's arguments against climate change are predicated on a profound misunderstanding of how climate modelling works, and his arguments against gun control are simplistic, naive, and completely egoistic. I find it staggering, even funny, that someone can just turn off their social conscience the way he has done. But then again, as a comedian, his purpose is to amuse, and so perhaps his behaviour is simply a clever ruse to get me to laugh at naive and selfish American conservatives. I hope so, because Mr. Crowder needs to grow up and read up if he wishes to make comedy out of serious issues without bastardising them.